Hi, I'm Emily, and before you decide, I'm one of those I'm too busy for family types. Let me start by saying I'm not. I love my family. I really do. But growing up, I learned early that sometimes it's better to stay invisible than to stand out. In my hometown in Ohio, everyone knows everyone, and reputations stick like glue. Some people wear theirs like a badge. I learned to keep mine tucked under my jacket. Most of my family thinks I'm quiet, unambitious. The kind of person who likes her books and her plants more than climbing ladders or shaking hands with CEOs. Honestly, I like those things too. But there's a side of me no one in my family has ever seen. That side, it sits in a Fortune 500 boardroom, wearing a tailored suit, speaking softly, and watching people reveal more than they realize. That side of me helps make decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars. That side of me is powerful, but no one knows it. Not my parents, not my cousins, not even my younger brother, Eric. Eric, if there's one thing he loves more than attention, it's bragging about power he doesn't have. He has this habit of dropping names of CEOs, executives, and people he works with, as if doing so somehow elevates him. And it works at least in front of the extended family who don't know him well. But me, I see through it. I always have. It was a Sunday night and the family had gathered at my parents' house. Mom had made her famous roast chicken, Dad was sneaking extra dessert onto his plate, and my cousins were crowded around the living room, phones in hand. Eric, predictably, decided this was his time to shine. My boss is a Fortune 500 CEO, he said, leaning back in his chair like he was some kind of celebrity. Yeah, the big leagues. I handle big projects. People listen to me. I'm basically untouchable at work. Everyone laughed, nodded, or gasped in awe, and for a moment, I let him have it. I let him think he was the center of attention. But inside, I froze. The CEO he mentioned? I knew him. I knew him very well. More than that, I didn't just know him, I had the ear of the board he reported to. I had sat in rooms where his decisions were questioned. I had read reports and emails that revealed patterns people were too afraid to confront. And now my little brother was bragging like he had the power of that office in his back pocket. I stayed quiet. I smiled politely, sipped my water, and nodded when someone asked him how he got so lucky. My heart was racing, not with anger, but with the thrill of knowing something he didn't even suspect. He had no idea the family dinner he thought was his stage was actually my chessboard. After dinner, while everyone else lingered in the kitchen talking about weekend plans, I slipped into the living room and pulled out my laptop. Normally, I wouldn't do this, family. Time is sacred. But curiosity got the better of me. I typed in his name quietly into the internal system I still had access to from my consulting work. What I found made me lean back in the couch, gripping the armrest. Multiple HR complaints. Documentation of misbehavior. Instances where he had intimidated colleagues or cut corners, and worst of all, he had been shielded because he liked to drop the CEO's name to scare people into silence. The arrogance, the entitlement, the ignorance. All of it right there in black and white. I closed the laptop slowly, taking a deep breath. I didn't feel anger, not yet. I felt something more dangerous: opportunity. Revenge, I realized, didn't have to be loud or messy. It could be quiet, calculated, perfectly procedural. And the best part, Eric had no idea it was coming. That night, I went to bed, smiling to myself. I didn't brag. I didn't threaten. I didn't even say a word to him. I just lay there thinking about the next few months. Because sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage anyone can have. And in this case, it was everything. Eric has this one line he repeats at every family gathering, like it's a mantra, a spell that makes him feel bigger than he really is. My boss is a Fortune 500 CEO. He says it with pride, almost like he's telling the room he owns the company, when in reality he's barely a mid-level project manager. But in our family, words matter. People hear him say it and nod, impressed. My uncles glance at each other. My cousins roll their eyes. And my parents, well, they just smile because it's Eric being Eric. He's always been loud, always been hungry for attention. That particular Sunday night, he had his audience. Everyone was crowded around the dining table, and he leaned back in his chair like a king surveying his kingdom. You know, he said, dropping the line like a heavy coin, my boss personally trusts me. I'm basically untouchable at work. I wanted to laugh, but instead, I kept my poker face. Inside, my heart skipped a beat, because the CEO he casually named, the very person he claimed protected him. That was my CEO. I knew him. Hell, I didn't just know him, I was on the same board that oversaw his every decision. The thought that Eric had been running around bragging about someone he didn't even understand made me want to roll my eyes and hide in the pantry as he went on. I realized just how dangerous ignorance can be when mixed with arrogance. He bragged about budgets he'd managed, projects he led, and initiatives he had saved, none of which were true in the slightest. But he didn't care. The performance metrics he talked about were inflated, distorted, or completely fabricated. He had convinced himself and apparently wanted everyone else to believe that he was indispensable. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to scroll on my phone, while really I was thinking, my mind raced with possibilities. Could I let this slide? Sure, but part of me wanted to see what would happen if I didn't. What if the family and maybe Eric himself realized that he wasn't untouchable? What if the little empire he'd built in his mind collapsed in front of him? Eric's voice carried across the room. I told Megan at work I could handle it all. Big projects, tight deadlines. She said I was the best person on the team. She said, "You're lucky to have a boss like him," and I am. Totally lucky. I swallowed my frustration. Megan, the project lead he mentioned, she'd actually filed a formal complaint months ago about his behavior. And here he was, using her name like a trophy. The audacity after dinner, while everyone lingered in the living room, Eric kept bragging. I don't know why people are always so stressed at work. It's easy when your boss is a Fortune 500 CEO. You just do what I do. They trust you. They rely on you. You're untouchable. I smiled, softly, quietly, and said nothing. I let him have his moment, because I was already plotting my next move and I didn't want him to see it coming. The truth is, revenge is more satisfying when the person who deserves it doesn't suspect a thing. And right now, Eric had no idea he was walking straight into the consequences of his own arrogance. Later that night, I went into my home office, closed the door, and opened my laptop. I started digging quietly, meticulously, methodically. I looked at project files, HR reports, emails, and internal notes. I wasn't looking to get him in trouble for personal reasons. I wanted to see the real story. And what I found? It was worse than I imagined. Eric had been reckless, arrogant, and careless at work. He'd taken shortcuts that endangered projects. He had intimidated coworkers. He had hidden behind the CEO's name to avoid accountability. And the most ironic part, that CEO trusted the board to act as a safeguard, not as a tool for Eric's delusions of importance. I closed the laptop, leaning back in my chair. For a moment, I imagined Eric standing in the boardroom, thinking he had power, only to realize he had none. My lips curved into a small, almost mischievous smile. This wasn't about family embarrassment. It was about justice, in the quietest, most effective way possible. I knew one thing for certain. Eric's next family dinner, or his next brag, would never be the same. And I, the quiet sister, would be the one setting everything in motion. Because sometimes, the best revenge doesn't involve shouting or drama. Sometimes it's calculated, silent, and unstoppable. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered about Eric that night. My little brother, the one who strutted around family dinners like a peacock, had no idea how precarious his untouchable status really was. And the kicker, the CEO he bragged about, the one he worshipped and used as his shield, was someone I not only knew but had influence over. It was a strange feeling, realizing that the person who thought they were untouchable was actually exposed. And here's the thing, I didn't feel anger. Not really, not yet. What I felt was a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and a slow-burning sense of justice. Eric had spent years climbing what he thought was a golden ladder, relying on his name-dropping and arrogance to carry him. And now, that ladder led straight to me. The next morning, I couldn't help checking my emails before my coffee. Habit, really. Board materials, executive summaries, HR updates, all the things most people would never even imagine existed. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled up Eric's internal record. I scrolled through page after page of complaints, project delays, and informal warnings. One by one, the lines told a story he didn't even know existed. He had belittled coworkers, dismissed concerns, and threatened to talk to the CEO personally whenever someone challenged him. Every single time it had worked, not because he was competent, but because middle management was too scared of executive retribution to act, and the CEO, totally unaware, not because he was blind, but because the board, which I was part of, trusted that things would be handled professionally. As I read, I realized something chilling. Eric had been lucky. Lucky that his small acts of intimidation had gone unnoticed by the right people. Lucky that no one had connected the dots between his behavior and the company's growing internal complaints. Lucky? Until now, I spent the next few days quietly gathering more information. Emails, project reports, HR notes. I collected it all like puzzle pieces. Every conversation I remembered from family dinners, every boast he'd made suddenly fit into a larger picture. Eric wasn't just arrogant. He was reckless. And recklessness, in my world, had consequences. What made it even more satisfying, though I didn't let myself think about it too much, was the irony. He had spent years trying to impress people with the idea of power. But he didn't even realize that true power doesn't need to be announced. It operates quietly, invisibly, and it has teeth when provoked. And I was sitting on it, calm, composed, and ready to act when the time was right. That weekend, at another family gathering, Eric was already in his element. He told cousins and aunts about big projects he led, managers who needed his guidance, and deadlines he had single-handedly saved. His chest puffed out as he recited the CEO's name like it was a magic password. I smiled politely. I nodded. I listened. But inside, I was counting the ways this story could end, ways that didn't involve yelling, arguing, or even exposing him in front of the family. The best revenge, I realized, would be procedural, clean, effective, and silent. Later that night, I called a friend who works in corporate compliance, not for gossip, but to get advice on the proper steps for documenting and escalating behavioral issues in a large organization. I wanted this to be by the book, unassailable. If Eric ever figured out what was happening, it couldn't be dismissed as favoritism or jealousy. It had to be facts, cold, undeniable facts. As I hung up, I realized something. Eric had no idea the storm he had invited into his life was already brewing. And the truth was, it wasn't personal. I wasn't angry at him. Exactly. I was disappointed. He had wasted opportunities, burned trust, and strutted around thinking his name-dropping made him untouchable. And now, the universe, well, me, technically, was about to teach him a lesson. The quiet thrill of that realization stayed with me long after the family dinner ended. I went to bed thinking about the next few months, how carefully I could let events unfold. Because in my world, patience is power. And when the time comes, even the most confident, boastful little brother will realize he isn't untouchable at all. I had always believed that power doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly, invisibly, and it has a way of exposing arrogance when you least expect it. That week, I realized just how true that was. Eric's little boasts at family dinners were one thing, but the reality of the corporate world, that was another story entirely. And now, I was in it. I remember walking into the boardroom that Thursday morning. The view from the top floor of the company's headquarters in downtown Chicago never failed to impress me. The skyline, the river, the hum of a city that never stopped moving. But my mind wasn't on the view. It was on Eric, on his recklessness, on the fact that someone so arrogant had no idea how fragile his position really was. The CEO, a man everyone respected but few really knew, was at the head of the table. He exuded confidence, the kind of calm that comes from years of experience and a track record of success. But even he wasn't untouchable. Even he had to answer to the board, and I had my own role in this delicate balance. The meeting started with the usual routine: financial reports, project updates, and operational metrics. I listened carefully, analyzing every word, every chart, every subtle shift in expression. My colleagues, seasoned board members, asked pointed questions about performance metrics, corporate ethics, and leadership accountability. And then, as if on cue, a discussion about employee conduct came up. A few murmurs from other board members hinted at complaints about mid-level management. Nothing specific, nothing tied to names. But I knew exactly who was at the center of those complaints, and I stayed silent. Patience is power, I reminded myself. Let them speak. Let the system do the work. As the CEO explained his perspective, defending his managers and claiming that oversight had been adequate, I could feel the tension in the room. Some board members were skeptical. Others seemed to accept the explanation at face value. I took meticulous notes, documenting inconsistencies, omissions, and any signs that management was failing to enforce ethical standards. Every piece of evidence was a puzzle piece, and slowly, the image of Eric's reckless behavior was forming in my mind. The irony was delicious. My little brother, who prided himself on being untouchable because of this CEO, was about to be revealed not as an indispensable employee, but as a liability. And the CEO. He had no clue that the very person he trusted to lead key projects had been acting recklessly. Hiding behind the aura of executive protection, as the discussion continued, I proposed a review of internal processes. Not to single anyone out, I told the board, but to ensure the company's long-term sustainability. I suggested an ethics audit, a thorough look at employee behavior, project management practices, and escalation procedures. Some members raised eyebrows, asking if it was necessary. I smiled politely and said, "It's always necessary when we want to protect the company's reputation and our employees." No one questioned me further. The motion passed unanimously. And just like that, the system was in motion. My brother's arrogance at family dinners had planted the seeds. Now, the corporate world was about to harvest them. Walking out of the boardroom later that afternoon, I felt a mix of exhilaration and calm satisfaction. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't gossiped. I had simply done my job, observed, documented, and acted according to the rules. The beauty of it was that the consequences would appear inevitable, logical, unavoidable. That evening, I called my best friend Megan, who worked in corporate compliance. I didn't spill details, but I asked her hypothetical questions. What happens if a mid-level manager repeatedly disregards procedure? What if HR complaints were ignored for months? How would the board handle that without alerting the CEO immediately? Megan laughed. You're planning something, Emily. Just don't get caught smiling too early. I hung up the phone and walked past the mirror in my apartment. My reflection looked calm, even composed, but inside, I was buzzing with anticipation. Eric had no idea what was coming. And the best part? By the time he realized it wouldn't be me who delivered the punishment, it would be the system itself. Power doesn't need to brag. It doesn't need to shout. And sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. The week after the board meeting felt surreal. On the outside, everything looked normal. Eric strutted into the office, greeted coworkers with that overconfident grin, and dropped the CEO's name like it was a shield he could hide behind. He still thought he was untouchable. But behind closed doors, the wheels of accountability were turning, and I was holding the map. After the board approved the ethics and culture audit, I quietly coordinated with the company's internal compliance team. I didn't directly involve Eric. That would have tipped him off. Instead, I worked through HR and the audit team to make sure every step was documented, thorough and unbiased. This wasn't personal, it was professional. But it was also deeply satisfying to see the cracks in his carefully constructed image start to appear. I started with emails and project records. Every time Eric boasted about saving a project or leading a team, I traced the evidence. Dates didn't match. Deadlines were missed. Complaints from team members which had been filed months ago had gone unresolved. The picture was crystal clear. He wasn't the unstoppable rising star he pretended to be. He was reckless, careless, and dangerously overconfident. Next came interviews. I observed as the HR team spoke with coworkers who had quietly endured his behavior for months. Some hesitated, afraid of retaliation. Others finally let their frustrations spill out. One junior employee admitted that Eric had once threatened her, saying, "You know who my boss is, right?" She had been too scared to report it at the time. Another recounted how Eric had taken credit for her work, claiming leadership roles he hadn't earned. Every story was a nail in his imaginary fortress of untouchability, and every time I read a report, I felt a quiet thrill. The system, the one I had trusted to protect the company and its people, was slowly dismantling the arrogance Eric had so carefully built. And the best part? He had no idea. I documented everything meticulously. Internal reports, emails, HR notes, timelines. It was all compiled into a comprehensive record that would leave no room for argument. I wasn't acting alone. The audit team was doing its job, and the CEO, blissfully unaware, continued to trust his managers. But the outcome was inevitable. Meanwhile, Eric's behavior became even more reckless. Perhaps sensing pressure at work he didn't fully understand, he doubled down on arrogance. He bragged openly in team meetings, micromanaged projects he shouldn't have touched, and ignored basic procedures. Each misstep added more evidence to the growing pile that would eventually decide his fate. One evening, after reviewing another batch of reports, I realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about one reckless employee. It was about a culture of complacency, a system that allowed people like Eric to think they could get away with anything. And now, the system was correcting itself, slowly, methodically, and without drama. I smiled, knowing that Eric would soon face consequences he never anticipated. Not because I wanted revenge in the traditional sense, but because he had created the circumstances for it himself. I didn't have to lift a finger. I just had to let the process unfold. And watching it do so was more satisfying than any confrontation could ever be. By the end of the week, the internal audit report was nearly complete. Patterns were clear, facts were irrefutable, and the narrative of Eric's supposed brilliance was crumbling. The compliance team would present findings to the board next week, and when it happened, Eric would finally learn that power isn't about dropping names or boasting, it's about accountability. That night, as I locked my laptop, I felt an unusual sense of calm. For months, I had been quietly gathering evidence, watching and waiting. Now, the momentum had shifted. Eric's world, built on arrogance and false confidence, was about to meet reality. And the quiet sister underestimated her whole life, would watch as justice unfolded. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't personal, it's inevitable. 2 months had passed since the audit began. On the outside, Eric still strutted around like nothing was wrong. He bragged about projects he barely touched, dropped the CEO's name in meetings, and flaunted his untouchable status. To everyone else, he was the same overconfident, arrogant little brother I'd grown up with. But I knew better. That weekend, we had another family dinner. Mom had made her famous lasagna. Dad had already claimed the biggest serving, and cousins were sprawled on the couch, scrolling through their phones. Eric, of course, was in full glory mode. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair with that smug grin, "my boss personally trusts me. I can handle anything at work. Honestly, I don't know why people are always so stressed. I'm lucky. Totally untouchable." I smiled politely and poured myself some wine. For a moment, I let him enjoy his little performance. But inside, I felt a quiet satisfaction because I knew the truth, and soon he would too. He continued to brag, completely unaware of the storm building just beneath the surface. "I basically run my team," he said, waving a fork for emphasis. "No one tells me what to do. Everyone just listens. You know, it's like having a license to do whatever." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. And then, casually, I asked, "Oh, really? So you've been getting a lot of feedback from HR lately?" His grin faltered. Feedback? What do you mean?" I shrugged, leaning back in my chair, the picture of calm. "Just curious. I hear sometimes companies look into employee behavior, complaints, reports, that kind of thing. It must be stressful when people start noticing patterns, huh?" For a split second, I saw doubt flash in his eyes. I knew then that the first crack had appeared. He tried to recover quickly. "Nah, it's nothing. HR loves me. Everyone loves me at work. Totally fine." I didn't say another word. I just let the silence hang long enough for him to feel it. I could see his confidence starting to wobble. His usual bravado, the armor he wore so effortlessly, was slipping, and I had done nothing more than plant a subtle seed after dinner. While everyone was still chatting in the living room, I slipped into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. Eric followed me, pretending to be casual, probably sensing that something had shifted. "You're being weird tonight," he said. "What's going on?" I smiled faintly, pouring water into a glass. "Nothing. Just thinking about work, you know?" I glanced at him casually. It must be exhausting carrying all that responsibility. All those projects, deadlines, and then pretending like no one notices when things go wrong. His face turned pale. For a moment, he opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no idea that my words weren't just idle chatter. They were informed. Every complaint, every missed deadline, every threat he had made to coworkers. I knew it all. And now it was starting to come home to him. Slowly but inevitably, that night, I went home and opened my laptop, checking the latest audit updates. The reports were coming in, documenting patterns of negligence, intimidation, and arrogance. Each page felt like a small victory, a quiet confirmation that justice was on its way. Eric didn't know it yet, but his safety nets, the CEO's supposed protection, was irrelevant. The system had been activated, and the evidence would speak for itself. As I closed my laptop and got ready for bed, I felt an odd mixture of calm and excitement. For months, I had watched, planned, and waited. Now, the consequences of Eric's own arrogance were creeping closer, and the most satisfying part, he didn't even know it. Not yet, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It just arrives quietly and changes everything. And when it finally hits, even the most confident, boastful little brother will realize he isn't untouchable after all. The day the audit report was presented to the board, I could feel the tension before I even stepped into the conference room. The city skyline glistened through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but I wasn't looking outside. I was focused on what was about to unfold. Months of careful observation, documentation, and strategic patience had led to this moment. And my little brother, blissfully unaware, was about to discover the truth the hard way. As the audit team laid out their findings, I sat quietly, taking notes, listening, and watching reactions. The reports were damning. Patterns of intimidation, reckless project handling, misappropriation of credit, and blatant disregard for procedures all tied directly to mid-level management, including Eric's name, which had been flagged repeatedly. The CEO, seated at the head of the table, leaned back in his chair. He was calm, too calm, but the small frown forming on his forehead told me he was starting to realize something was off. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his tone measured. "Several months," the lead auditor said, flipping through the compiled evidence. And in several instances, complaints were either ignored or dismissed because employees were intimidated by references to executive leadership. I felt a quiet satisfaction. That last line was Eric in a nutshell. He had built his empire on fear and name-dropping. And now, the same system he had thought would protect him was exposing every misstep. Board members started asking questions, tough ones. Questions about accountability, oversight, and the company culture that allowed someone like Eric to think he was untouchable. I stayed quiet, letting the facts speak. I didn't need to embellish. The documentation was enough. The discussion turned toward consequences. The CEO shifted uncomfortably, realizing he had unknowingly shielded a liability rather than a rising star. "We need to take action," one board member said firmly. Immediate action, and then the discussion turned to Eric. Not by name in public, but his actions were clearly highlighted. HR recommended immediate termination paired with a full review of managerial practices. The board debated the best way to handle it, considering legal ramifications and company reputation. I listened, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at my lips. This was procedural justice at its finest. By the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. Eric would be removed from the company quietly, but decisively. No scandal, no dramatic confrontations, just accountability. The system had done its work, and I had been its quiet architect. Meanwhile, back at the family front, Eric remained oblivious. He continued to text me updates about big projects and how well the CEO trusts him, completely unaware that the moment of reckoning was inevitable. I almost felt sorry for him, but only almost. When HR delivered the termination notice to Eric, he was stunned. He couldn't understand how this had happened. He had bragged, relied on the CEO's name, and acted untouchable for months. Yet here he was, escorted from the building with his badge deactivated and his access revoked. The arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that power could be claimed through name-dropping alone, all collapsed in an instant. I didn't gloat. I didn't send him a text or call to say, "I told you so." I didn't have to. The system had done what I couldn't do publicly. It had delivered consequences proportional to his arrogance. Watching it unfold quietly, methodically, was infinitely more satisfying than any confrontation could ever have been. That night, as I walked through my apartment, I felt a strange mix of relief and vindication. Months of planning, patience, and quiet observation had led to a result that was fair, logical, and utterly inevitable. Eric had learned a lesson not through threats, yelling, or family shame, but through the undeniable power of accountability. And for the first time in months, I realized something important. Power doesn't need to be announced. Authority doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes the quietest person in the room, the one who listens, observes, and acts strategically, is the one who changes everything. Eric had finally found out. The boastful little brother who thought he was untouchable now faced the reality that arrogance without accountability is a fragile illusion. And I, the quiet sister, had made sure he learned that lesson perfectly. The days after Eric's termination were surreal. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The office continued to hum with activity. Projects moved forward, and the CEO carried on as if nothing had happened. But behind the scenes, the lesson had been delivered. The man who thought he was untouchable, my little brother, had finally learned that arrogance and name-dropping couldn't protect him. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't need to. Part of me wanted to see how he would handle the truth when he realized what had happened, and he did eventually. It started with subtle questions from family members. I heard Eric left the company. One cousin asked at a weekend lunch, "Yeah, what happened?" Another chimed in. Eric tried to spin a story, something about wanting a new opportunity, a better path, but his voice lacked conviction. The confident, boastful swagger that had carried him through family dinners and office meetings was gone. I watched him, quietly sipping my iced tea, letting him squirm just a little. I didn't gloat, didn't smile too widely. I let the situation speak for itself. The beauty of quiet revenge is that it doesn't need to be loud. You don't announce it. You let consequences unfold naturally, and they're always more powerful that way. The truth hit him in the moments he least expected. At work, his colleagues whispered. HR followed procedures he couldn't argue with. Even his former team members, the ones he'd belittled and intimidated, knew. And when he tried to brag about connections, he found no one to impress. No CEO, no board, no colleagues, just silence. I think the hardest part for Eric was realizing that his untouchable status had been an illusion. Everything he had built, all the pride he had worn like armor, depended on people not noticing his recklessness. But now, it had all come apart, and it wasn't me who dismantled it, it was the system, and I had simply ensured it worked as intended. A week after the news reached him, Eric came to me. He didn't storm in, didn't yell, didn't demand explanations. He just looked at me, confused and defeated. "Emily, you knew, didn't you?" he said quietly, like a child realizing the truth about Santa Claus. I didn't lie. "Yes," I said softly. "I knew, but I didn't make it happen." "You did." He looked down, embarrassed, ashamed. And in that moment, I realized something important. Revenge isn't about humiliation. It isn't about shouting or proving you're right. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is quiet. It's procedural, it's inevitable, and it's unforgettable. We didn't fight. We didn't argue. We didn't even dwell on it. Eric had learned his lesson. I had been patient. I had been calm, and the results were perfect. Justice had been served without chaos, without drama, without anyone needing to step outside the rules. That night, as I sat by my window looking at the city lights, I thought about what had happened. All those months of careful observation, planning, and patience had led to a single inevitable outcome. Eric had walked into a situation he couldn't control. built on his own arrogance, and I, the quiet sister who no one ever took seriously, had simply let the truth work. Power, I realized, doesn't need to be loud. Authority doesn't need to be announced. Confidence isn't about bragging or name-dropping, it's about understanding the rules, observing carefully, and letting consequences unfold naturally. Eric eventually moved on, found another job, and I like to think he learned something important. That confidence built on arrogance is fragile. That the people you underestimate might just be the ones quietly holding the real power. And as for me, I returned to my life quietly influential, quietly satisfied, knowing that sometimes the best revenge is invisible, inevitable, and perfect in its silence because the quiet sister had spoken and Eric had finally listened.